This episode of the Briar Patch is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. Want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Robert Picardo, the emergency medical hologram from Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
This is the 24th century. We've grown out of our infancy. People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We've eliminated hunger, want. Material needs no longer exist. The acquisition of wealth is no longer the driving force in our lives. Enjoy.
Welcome to the Briar Patch. I'm Patrick Devlin, joined today, as always, by our co-host, Guinevere Liberty Nell. Hello, Guinevere.
Hi, Patrick.
So far, we have had broader topics. This episode, we were doing a close study of the Voyager episode, Critical Care, connecting it to the broader study of economics and sociology, especially economic organization and markets versus planning in particular, where we will also fold in social stratification and game theory.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to this episode. Critical Care is a really great Voyager episode, and I think it raises a lot of really interesting questions in economics, especially the question of markets and planning and the way that they affect the allocation or distribution, or both, in a given society. So I'm really looking forward to this. How are you doing today, Patrick?
I'm doing good. I'm going to enjoy this. I like this time we actually get to do a real sociological look at parts of this episode, which before we were looking more just at the economics or just at the sociologic issues, where now it's kind of more of a mixed bag between the two studies, which I think will be interesting. But before we do that, you want to give a quick synopsis of the episode?
Sure. So this episode involves primarily the doctor, the holographic doctor on Voyager, and his trip. Well, he was, I guess, kidnapped and brought to a planet, and he, being a doctor, was used by the people on that society, on that planet. Those people had a system, an allocator, they called it. It was basically a computer allocation system which determined the needs or the way to allocate resources, medical resources across the society based on the way that the individual gave back to the society. So the allocator decided you're a worthwhile person or you're not a worthwhile person, and on that basis allocated the scarce resource of medical care across the whole society. So you could see it as the distribution of the goods. You can also see it as the allocation of resources, which they were hoping if they allocated it efficiently by giving it to the more important people, then the society would also benefit because these people would give back to the society. So it's very interesting, raises a lot of interesting questions, both about the sort of ethics of medical care, as well as the allocation of resources, and as well as the end distribution of what people in the society are, receive from the society.
Right. It also talks about what a person's worth to a society is. That's where the social stratification will come in. You end up where they deem an engineer is more valuable than a waste disposal person. They don't see them as contributing to society in the same way, in which case they're going to save and even prevent disease for the engineer, while the same medication that's preventing disease for one who doesn't have it yet will not be given to the one who has it. And because that might save their life or prolong their life 40% longer. It's more worthwhile to give it to them and let them live longer than it is to even save a child.
Right, exactly. So there are a lot of really interesting questions that this raises about allocation. And one obvious thing is whether they can even know who deserves it more. And when you're talking about children or anyone who can learn and grow, there's a very obvious issue that maybe that person would be worth more to the society, would be more valuable to the society later, and you don't know that at the time. However, although, you might think, well, this doesn't apply to us because we don't have an allocator, we don't have a computer allocator. In fact, it doesn't only raise the issue as a sort of metaphorical thing or a what if thing. It actually, I think, is a great lens with which we can view our own system and various different systems that you see around the world. Don't you think? It represents it very well, and it raises the issues very well.
I think so. I believe that it shows in great detail the difference between treatment the rich and the poor would get in, say, a country like the United States, where if I have money for the top doctors, I'm going to survive a lot better than someone who goes to, say, clinics. And I say that word knowing that people live across the world listening to us. Clinics in America are not good things. I know in a lot of other countries, most other countries, you want to go to a clinic. In America, you want to avoid clinics at all costs and go to private practices. So just want to make that delineation now, because I'll probably say the word clinic a few times. It's not the place you want to be. It's really for the poor, people who can't pay, government assistance, those kind of programs.
Yeah, good point. I have a clinic here in London where I live that is quite good. But yeah, so no, you raise exactly the point that I want to raise. And it may be obvious to some viewers, but I think for others, they may not have quite picked up on the way that this metaphor represents U.S. healthcare or market-based healthcare in general, especially for those who haven't experienced it. If they live somewhere that has, like in the UK, a national healthcare service, they may not, maybe they would see it and they'd say, that's why we don't want that. But they may also see it in a different light because, in fact, the computer allocation system in the episode could be seen, and perhaps some in America would see it this way as well. It could be seen as kind of the planning of healthcare. So some in America who are afraid of or think poorly of the idea of a single payer healthcare system might look at this episode and say, yeah, that's why I don't want a single payer healthcare system. That's why I don't want planning of healthcare. Because if you have a planner, indeed, that planner makes decisions on how to allocate the resources. And in fact, if they are scarce resources, as we discussed in the last episode on utopia and scarcity, if you have scarce resources and you therefore have to find a way to ration them, and so you have a planner and they make these decisions, they could, like this computer allocation system, determine this person is more valuable to society, this person's less so, therefore we should give the scarce resource of this healthcare, of this medicine, to the one who's more valuable. Even, as you say, if the more, quote unquote, more valuable member only needs it for some preventative care, and the quote unquote least valuable, lesser valuable member of society needs it to save their life, the planner, the allocation system might decide to give it to the more valuable person who doesn't barely need it. So, but although this could be seen as this planning of healthcare, this allocation system, and that is indeed an issue if you have planning in an economy, it also is very representative of the way the market system works anyway, because the market tends to reward in money people's contribution to the society, supposedly, at least, right? So if I take on a job that few other people want, but is very important to the society, the market system will tend to give me a good wage for that. Now, this is not always true, obviously. There are healthcare jobs like nursing care and so forth that get paid very little. And that's often because the person that you're helping can't themselves make a lot of money, so they can't afford to pay a lot. But in any case, in most jobs across the market system, you'll tend to get paid very well if the job is very important to the society, if people value it, if people think that you're producing something of great value, you'll end up making good money off of it. And so then if you have that good money, you're able to buy better healthcare. So if you have a market system in healthcare, what you'll end up having is an allocation like this, where the person who's supposedly very valuable to the society is able to get very good care, and the person who, based on the market, appears to be less valuable to the society will have less money and will only be able to buy, if anything, less high quality healthcare. So it's a very good sort of metaphor or way of presenting what actually can happen in a market-based healthcare system in a market society.
Yes, I agree with everything you just said. It also doesn't take into account the fact that just because someone's perceived to be more important, that they might not necessarily actually be more important to the society. People would see menial jobs as being less important to a society, but I guarantee you that if tomorrow people didn't take out garbage or, make sure the sewers worked or cleaned even the trash cans at most of these people's offices, that society would be up in arms not knowing what to do, even though it seems like a simple enough solution to just clean your own garbage can. But then where does it go after that? How does it get taken away? Where does it... Before we had garbage men and, normal maintenance, we had much more disease. Before we had the pipes that ran our plumbing, that took waste from our house and left, we had a lot more disease. These things all were changed by what is perceived, in this society as a lower class of human. The problem is there's also a lot more people who do that job than say head of surgery for a major hospital branch.
Yes, well, that was exactly what I was going to say, is because there is both the supply and demand. And so although when you think about it, actually we do really require and demand people to take out our garbage, it is very important for the society that this gets done. Still, because it's a low-skilled job, there are more people willing, well, maybe not willing at the moment, but willing at a high enough wage and able, certainly, to do that job. So how labor is paid is actually based on both this supply and the demand of it. And so although these jobs may actually be important to the society, if anyone can do it, then the person who is currently doing it is not necessarily highly valued by the society. And this is reflected in the wages. So if there were very few people able to do the garbage job, then the wage would go up, as it does for, say, a heart surgeon or something, because there are very few people able to do that job. It's not only that it's highly valued, it's also that there are few people able to supply that labor.
Right, absolutely. And the only thing that the episode doesn't go into, which I would have liked it to have been mentioned at some point, if you allow all the people who do take out your garbage to die, you eventually end up with the reverse problem where you actually don't have enough people to do the lower end jobs. Because if I'm qualified to be a doctor, I'm not going to take a job, say, delivering your newspaper or taking out garbage, when I know that I'll end up in the worst place with the, worst medical care if I do that.
Sure. But I think the way that that's handled in the episode is that they are not caring for these people that have the low skilled jobs, but even so, they are treating them. And so say, in this society in which they don't care about them, maybe a third of them will die off. Maybe even half of them will die off because they're not getting proper treatment. But 100% of them are probably not going to die off because they are getting some treatment and so forth. So as you say, if the number who could do that job went down to zero, there would be a serious problem. But if the number of people available to do that job just went down by 30% or 50%, maybe all of those jobs could still be done. So that's the kind of heartless calculation that is being done by this society. And in a sense, also what is being done in market societies, allowing some of the poor to die off. But basically the market will still manage to take care of a good percentage of them. And so there'll still be enough to fill those jobs.
Yeah, I suppose. A long term, 1-2 generations, maybe. I just don't see that being a viable system for 10, 20, 30 generations down the line.
Well, it's worked. It's worked as a market system. It has been doing that for many, 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 many generations. So I do think it is possible because only some die off. And the system, because it is this reinforcing system that continues to improve supposed efficiency. It may not be actual efficiency, but there are some efficient aspects to it. And so the economic system continues to grow. And over time, perhaps fewer people are dying off because the overall amount and quality of medication is improving over time. So over time, even the poor will eventually get some of these medications. And so over time, perhaps fewer of them die. It is a very heartless calculation, but it is what we've been living with, in a sense, with markets for countless generations. And we have seen when the markets are allowed to work that you do have efficiency and you do have growth and so on. And the poor are much, much better off than they used to be, even though compared to the rich, they seem to be doing worse. In real terms, in the absolute level of wages, of income, and the absolute level of poverty, the wages are increasing and the absolute poverty is dropping, even though in relative terms, compared to the rich, they seem to oftentimes be doing worse than they used to. So I think that is quite well covered in the episode, actually.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I just don't think it's a 1-to-1 ratio, because what you have in that society is an absolute rule. They do not get the medicine. I don't care if they're dying, end of story. Whereas there are ways around it, even in a system like the United States. If you are completely poor, unable to put food on the counter, there are still ways of getting medications. They may not be the best. They might not be as quick as we would like them to be, but there are ways around it, and it usually takes a lot of paperwork and fighting and arguing. But in that system, there isn't even that. There's no appeals process. There's no going to some other clinic. There's no finding a free clinic. There's no van driving around giving out medication or preventative items like you have here in the United States. So I think the die-off would be a lot worse. I also think that if you look through history, we've watched that mass die-offs did happen in these systems, which did reverse the problem, which did make it so that there were less people doing the quote-unquote lower-end jobs, which caused them to get better benefits in the long run, or better wages, or benefits in general. You also have in countries like the United States where workers bond together and form unions, which cause the forcing of their employers to give them benefits, which is factored into wage. It's a monetary... They don't see it as a monetary wage because people mostly talk about wages. They talk about their paycheck, not their full package. But these things have happened that have risen that lower level up higher, much higher than is shown in this episode.
Absolutely. I think the way that I look at it is that this episode is saying, imagine that we had a computer allocator, and this is how we did the healthcare allocation decisions. And the viewer can watch it and say, well, that seems really harsh. I don't think I'd want that. So then you're forced to think, well, what are we getting out of the market system? And when you think about it, in many ways, you're getting the same outcome that you get with the allocator system. And it's true, not entirely. You may have, charity. You may have other help for people. You may have other sources, other ways that they can get a medication. Maybe the medication price drops for the poor in certain cases, so they're able to buy it cheaper for themselves, and so on. But overall, the allocation still seems quite similar for the reasons that we discussed before, where the market gives you higher wages for certain jobs that are deemed to be important, and then you're able to get better medication and so on. So it forces you to think, well, is this the way that we really want this to work? Because if we had a computer doing this, we would be outraged. But because we have the market doing it, we're somehow not outraged. So I think that's a very interesting metaphor that it can provide in that sense. And there's a further metaphor on the economic side, which is that the people from this society said to the doctor, the reason that they put the allocator in place is because they had a society that was falling apart. And when they instituted this, they got the greater efficiency. And you can see this in a sense when you look at before the kind of the big boom of markets, you had, when you had empires and you had caste and class systems and terrible kinds of oppression, and you didn't allow people to engage in markets in the same way that we do now, you would have a society falling apart, and then they would introduce, in a sense, an allocator, but in this case, a market as an allocator, and that brought incredible growth and changed the society and made it wealthier. And that's exactly what they're saying happened in this system. So markets are great in a lot of ways, but maybe not for allocating medication to people. Maybe when it's life and death and you're worried about saving one person versus just helping another, maybe you shouldn't be thinking about what they give to the society to make that decision. Maybe you should consider life and other values like that more important than what the person is able to give back to the society, at least once you kind of get the society back on its feet.
Right. The allocator is like a really good short-term fix. It's not really a great long-term goal. I wouldn't want to sit with that system at all. And like you said, I actually live in a country where we have basically this system, or a very similar system anyway. I am not a supporter of our health system in this country by any stretch of the imagination. And unfortunately, it's the one I have, though. So I'll have to live and deal with it and hope that I don't end up on the blue level.
Right.
That I do end up on the blue level, I should say.
Right. It's the blue level is the good one, isn't it?
Yes. It's not the critical care level. It's the area that's most critical we give good care to.
Right.
Which sounds terrible when he says it. I mean, it's horrible. And you can even see just by the area in which they're in what they think of the people on each of those levels. Because when you walk into, when you first see them, when you first see the society in general, you see the ship flying over, it's a very dystopian society. I mean, it looks like New York City in the 1970s and 80s. There's smog everywhere. You can't really see the buildings through it, and everything's like rusted and brutal. And then you end up in the hospital and it looks exactly the same, which makes sense, right? The society looks terrible. The hospital looks terrible. Okay, I get it. This is all terrible. But then when they introduce you to the blue level, you're like, wait a second. This is like being on a starship again. They have everything here. Then they give the woman, I believe it was a woman, the first one. They give her I can't remember what the name of the injection was, but she didn't have the disease that required that medication. But they told him, well, it prevents arterial breakdown or something along those lines.
Arterial sclerosis or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, and it means that she'll live 40% longer. She's not really being treated for anything. This is just, we give the rich people, I say the word rich, but what we deem the higher end, we give them this every day so they can live 40% longer, so they can contribute to society longer. And like you said, that's not really taking into account what can that child that's now dying because he needs that medication and can't get it, what can he contribute to society? Because on top of all of this, they've already deemed that all he can do is work in the mines. His father works in the mines, so he's going to work in the mines. So since he's going to work in the mines, that's all he's worth. And they take all this, your social status, your family name, I guess, whatever they feel like throwing into this computer, your knowledge, your schooling, and they come up with this TC, which is treatment coefficient. They give you a number and you're stuck at that level no matter what.
Right. And so you never have a chance to show what value you might be to the society. If, you become sick or you die, you'll never have a chance to prove it to them. And they had trouble even trying to convince the computer that they had gained some new talent or skill. So you're going to have to go through someone to prove that. So on the first point, the fact that you can't prove that you're doing better, that happens in a market as well. If you're poor and you don't get good medical care, how are you going to become wealthier in order to make more money? You're starting from a disadvantaged position. So that's quite like the market. But I guess the other side is, it does seem a bit more like a planned economy when you wonder, how to prove that someone is something that they're not seen as. I mean, I guess that happens in a market as well, but there are certain cases where it looks a little bit more like a planned economy. And one example of that is when the doctor begins to try to game the system. And he says, well, we have to ask for more now of this medicine. Otherwise, next time they're going to say, oh, well, you did well with that level, so we're going to give you even less or certainly no more. And so they had to ask for more than they needed in order to be able to get more the following cycle. And that happens in planned economies, actually. It's called the ratchet effect. And it's well known that when you have a planned economy, the, say, factory workers or factory managers, rather, will ask more from the government department or the planner in order that they can, in order that they don't have to make do with less. What if they're going to need more next cycle? Well, let's ask for more now. They'll know that we need more. And then next cycle, it'll be easier to get more again and so forth. And it's called the ratchet effect. So it's interesting how it does kind of cross over on both. But that is, again, why I say it's kind of like you look at this sort of metaphor where it is kind of planned and it is this, computer allocator. And you say, is this the result we would want? If we were, say, planning it, would we do this? Or would we be as cold-hearted as to plan it out like this, as to make these decisions? And if not, do we really want the market to do it? And I find that some free market economists tend to separate the two. And they say, I wouldn't want government to impose something like this on people. I'm against that. I'm libertarian. I believe the government should not use force. It should not force things through. It should not, tell us what to do. But when the market does it, even if what the market does is worse for people, they're okay with it because it's not a person doing it. It's a impersonal system. But we are choosing what system we want, especially if we're talking about a single industry, because perhaps you can't choose a different system for the whole economy. Perhaps you need markets, at least at the moment, while we have scarcity. But you can choose it for a specific industry. You can say, is this how we want to ration out healthcare? Is this how we want to allocate the resources that go into keeping people alive?
Well, they even touch on that in the episode, because at one point when the doctor finds out that Tebis had died because the infection came back and he wasn't given the medicine because he had already received his allocation for the year, he yells at the head of the hospital, who I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he yells at him, about ethics, and they go with a back and forth. You can't lecture me on ethics, you stole. And he says, well, you're supposed to be doling out health, or are you just killing the weak? So on and so forth. He basically says, they put me here because they don't want to make the tough decisions, which is taking a shot at the people who say, like you said, well, the market should dictate it, but as long as the market is dictating their death, I'm okay with it. I just don't want to be me saying they have to die. I don't know if that was their intent, but that is a shot. You can interpret that as a shot at that line of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't want to see the decision that you're still essentially making by choosing the healthcare system to be a market-based system. You're essentially, if you have a choice, still choosing that it be allocated in that way, but you don't want to see it, you don't want to think about it, and you certainly don't want to be responsible for it.
Right, you can wipe your hands of it, and it's okay because in the episode, the computer decided they don't get the medicine. Or in a system like America, you can just say, well, they couldn't afford it. They don't have a job that pays them enough, or they didn't get medical benefits. They should have got a second job, or they should have went and got a better job, or they should have gone to school longer. Things like that, really save you from having to carry the burden of their death on you, because you decided to do that.
Right. And there is a difference between actively doing something and passively allowing it to happen. And there is a difference between making something a law and having a system in which it may or may not occur, but is more likely to occur unless someone intervenes. So it's the default position that could happen unless someone intervenes, for example, and provides free healthcare to the poor. But, before the modern medical industry, earlier, before even Medicaid and Medicare came around, you had a system that was essentially a market economy in America, but you had at the local level doctors making choices where they gave a lot of free healthcare to the poor. And in a sense, when you look at the history of how things changed, obviously a modern economy is going to be different than a kind of a earlier pre-modern sort of economy, and MRI machines or other things are very expensive and so forth. But you do wonder if some of the other changes to the industry perhaps made it harder for doctors to give free healthcare and so on, and whether other kinds of interventions have changed this. And maybe, in a sense, markets don't have to treat the poor so indifferently, perhaps because markets are made up of people, doctors are people. If they're able, maybe doctors would be very happy to give free healthcare to the poor. But because of the other changes that have happened in the system, it's made it more difficult. It's become more bureaucratic, and you have insurance companies, and a lot of things were created by the American Medical Association, the union, that changed the way that things were done and the way that people were, where decisions were made. Maybe the doctors aren't able to make that decision as much anymore, because they have to answer to insurance companies and so on.
Right. And one of the biggest problems is actually the insurance company in this whole, I look at it as a trifecta. You have the doctors and the hospitals, right? You have the insurance companies, and then you have the pharmaceutical companies, because the doctors mostly need the pharmaceuticals to treat most of the things that they're treating nowadays in one way, shape, or form. And while the pharmaceutical companies are looking for huge profits, they are doing the research and development, so they're taking the risk with their money, so they deserve to make money. We can debate on how much profit they should be making or how out of hand it could get with certain drugs, but they do deserve to make their profits, right? And on top of that, I have personal experience with people who work in the pharmaceutical sales industry, where one of the biggest things their doctors want is free samples. They're always looking for the samples because they can hand it off to someone who maybe doesn't have the best insurance and give them a 2-month supply, and that saves them $1,000 maybe, or whatever it is. And then maybe someone who does have great health insurance, they don't give them anything because they know that it's going to cost them $100. There's a big difference there. And usually, again, if you have the better health insurance, you probably have a better paying job.
Right.
Not always true. Not necessarily. For instance, I live in New York City, and I make, I'll give a round number, but I make $50 an hour in my paycheck. I have really good health insurance, though. Health, dental benefits. Across the country, it's very similar. In California, it's very similar, the cost of living. They don't have any health insurance whatsoever, but they make $95 an hour. That's the offset. I have better health insurance than they can afford, even though they make so much more money, because we buy in bulk, we get better rates. So our insurance is actually better than theirs.
I'll have to jump in here and question your point, because if someone makes $95 an hour, if they took $45 an hour, that's almost half of their paycheck, and bought insurance with it, I'm sure they could get at least as good insurance as you have.
Not in this country.
It's just people don't want to spend half of their money on insurance. But if they did, then they would have the same wage and the same insurance as you. And certainly they could get as good insurance for less than half of their paycheck.
No, the numbers don't work out. My package costs $55 an hour.
Your insurance
Correct.
package costs $55 an hour.
Correct.
That's insane.
It's welcome to America. But the numbers don't work out. And mine costs $55 on a Cadillac plan, which means there's 30,000 of us paying into it.
Okay. I can't imagine how you could have to spend $55 an hour.
Well, I don't. My boss does. It's part of my deal. But that's irrelevant. My whole package is... I'm really giving round numbers here, too. But... because I don't actually make 50 even. That's another story. I just don't want to get into actual numbers. But it is somewhere around their money, their difference, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of 45, would not cover insurance that is as good as mine. Wow.
I wonder how much is spent from, say, the National Health Service here in the UK on the average person in a year. And then also if you have insurance instead of, insurance companies need to average everyone out essentially. So you would think that whatever it is that the average insurance costs, if you average things out, would be the average amount that they would have to spend as well, minus a little profit difference.
Yes, you would, but it doesn't, business doesn't really work that way either, because again, if that individual wants to buy in to, let's just say Blue Cross, right? So say they want to buy into Blue Cross, they're buying in as an individual, so they're going to pay a higher rate than I'm going to pay, theoretically, because I'm not actually paying out of pocket, but than me, because we're buying as 30,000 people.
Sure. But again, when you scale up to the entire country or the entire population that's covered by insurance, again, it's the average. And so some people, if you're an insurance company, you may have some people paying very little, some people paying a lot. That's why when you pool together, you're able to get a better rate because they know they're getting 30,000 people at once. And, so there's they're willing to maybe give you a bit of a deal because they're getting so many customers at once, but still, essentially, they need to pool everyone and they need to cover. They know some people will end up costing them a lot in the future. Some people won't. And they may charge slightly differential, but ultimately they need to make sure that whatever costs they incur in the future are covered by the payments people are making now. So you still should come ultimately to the conclusion that overall your average payments should add up. And of course they can invest it and earn over time, but they also have to make payouts now. So the average that people are putting in terms of insurance, over the course of a year and averaged out should be covering the costs that the average person is costing over the course of a year. In any case, I think we should get back to the episode a bit. So, well, one thing is when you're looking at the allocation of medical care, you're looking at not only the individuals being cared for, but you're also looking for the staff in the hospital. You're looking for the allocation of resources across the economy to be able to cover that care, which in the different system may come from insurance, it may come from a public sector program, or it may come through the market. And one thing that you notice in market economies is you also have a lot of people who are providing those services not being well reimbursed because the people, if it's coming through the market, the people who need those services aren't able to pay for it. So for example, people nursing care, people who help out the disabled and the elderly and so forth, when they need help, are very undervalued. And so when you come back, when you look at the episode and you look at the way that they value people, you also have to think about that some people are not being valued, say, in the market because they're helping other people who can't afford it. So, the computer allocator system would similarly say, well, you're only caring for people on the whatever it is, red level, and they don't matter. They're not important to society. So, we're not going to give you the resources to help them, maybe, which is like the market is not going to pay people to do that.
Yeah, you see that all over. It's one of the biggest complaints actually in the United States about their system is that the people who build and maintain the hospitals can't afford to be in the hospital. They can't even stay in their own hospital and get treatment because they're not paid well enough. You don't see it so much in bigger cities like New York and California, the cities in California, Miami, Chicago, because typically, again, the hospital itself is providing the insurance for the patient. So even if they're not paid very well, they can still usually have good enough insurance to go to the hospital. But you do see this often in rural areas or people who work at doctors' offices. They only get treatment from their doctor because their doctor does it for free. They can't really afford the medicines half the time, maybe not half the time, but enough of the time. The people who maintain it, the guy who cleans the floors or the crew that comes in at night and, vacuums the rugs and cleans down the desks and stuff like that, they can't afford to go to these doctors. They can't afford these medications. They have to hope.
Right, unless they're also given that perk. I mean, you do sometimes get that if you work somewhere, then you're able to get that as like a perk to your wage, that you get to use the services there. But yeah, that's terrible.
It's a big problem in the system because the other problem too is, again, we get to the issue of people being outside the system. We've spoken about this before, about technically outside the system, but not really. The people who are manufacturing the medications, a lot of them can't afford because they're basically just people on a line. The drug ingredients going at one end, someone grabs the pills and puts them in a package at the other end, and that's it. They're very low-skilled jobs, so they're very underpaid jobs. They're technically outside their manufacturers, they're factory workers, but they are within the system and can't use the system.
Yeah. So we see that in the episode a bit, in the sense that the people who want to work and help in the, whatever it is, the red level, the poor level, are not given the resources that they need to help them, and are, probably not treated as well, or, for lack of a better term, I guess, paid as well for what they're doing. It's not shown in that way directly, but you can see they don't have the resources to help them. And if you think about it, that's again what happens in a market system, is you don't have the resources to help the people who are not expected to give back enough to society, who are seen as less in a sense because they're poor, or they're poor because they're seen as less by the market. So yeah, it raises a lot of these questions. I find it fascinating. Now, you said something at the beginning about game theory. Will you tell me more about what you were thinking about that?
In this episode, we have an A plot and a B plot, right? Now, game theory happens in both plots, but just to go over real quick, the A plot is the doctor trying to treat the sick no matter where they are on that TC scale. And the B plot is the crew and Janeway trying to get the doctor back. So in game theory, which has become more of an economic theory, but it is a sociological theory at its core, you basically have two or more players, right? Like any game, any board game you might play or video game, you have two or more players. The assumptions that usually get criticized is that A, everyone knows they're playing, which isn't always true. B, that everyone knows the rules of the game they're playing, and that everyone works logically. No one ever makes an illogical move. Those three things get it criticized a bunch, but for the most part, I agree with game theory in this regard. You see Janeway going back, right? And she's trying to find out what happened to the doctor. So they chase down a ship they believe is the thieves, who in fact use game theory to get the doctor in the first place by replacing the doctor with a training hologram version of himself so they wouldn't notice as quickly. They track him down, but when they try to track him down, they find out that this guy's robbed everybody. And they want to give back to the people that have been robbed what they lost, but they really want to just get the doctor back. Then they find out that one guy lost his wife to the thief. So instead of going in and telling her that, they proposition her with, oh, well, we have a deal for him so that she'll give him the whereabouts. These are all calculated moves, like on a chessboard. They're literally playing a game to try and find him, and we're watching it played out little by little over time. It also plays out with the doctor. The doctor finds that the rules are only people in blue get the medicine. Problem is, people on red need the medicine. So he breaks the rules of the game. See, he doesn't play logically according to the allocator, which in turn requires there to be punishments doled out. And what we typically see, which is the worst part of this, is typically the people who are punished are the ones who are of the lower class, people who are on the lower rungs, because the doctor's too valuable to punish any meaningful punishment. So they take it out on the lower people and just stop their medications altogether, even though they didn't necessarily break the rules of the game at first. So to end this game, the doctor has to do something drastic. Again, since we're talking about society, pretty much everything is within the rules of the game. So what he does is he injects the guy who runs the hospital with a disease and with the blood of someone who is actually of a lower class, so that he's stuck on red level with no ability to get the medication he needs. The part I find most interesting is the doctor convinced, like you were saying before, the doctor convinced the medical professional who ran the hospital, not the bureaucrat. He convinced him that he needs to use more medications in order to continue getting them. Well, that's a great show of game theory, because now they're just playing a game with the computer. Who can win first? Can I continue to get more medicine or not? He does this basically to get it down to red. He really doesn't care if blue gets more medication. That wasn't his end game, but it's a part of the game that helps him get to his means, so he does it. When they inject the head of the hospital with a disease, the medical professional comes over and basically tells him, sorry, man, I got to listen to the rules. I can't help you. Again, all part of the game, because he wants a change in the system. He's not doing it for altruistic reasons like the Voyager doctor is. He's doing it because he doesn't want to ever get reallocated down to red himself. But it still all works out into game theory.
Yeah. Very well said. I think that you're entirely right. I certainly think that a very good example of game theory takes place when the doctor injects he has to change to treat everyone better. Otherwise he'll be treated as badly and he'll die. And he's taking this calculated risk. He's putting it out there. He's willing to do something that might get himself in trouble. It might get others into trouble. He's taking that risk because the rational thing for the professional to do now is to go along and change how everyone is treated. And so the win out of it is this great reward that'll affect both himself and all of the people the doctor wants to help. And it's set up in this kind of strategic way, and he's taking a risk, and he's taking this step, and he's playing this game, and he's trying to produce this outcome. And we could get heavily into game theory, and maybe we'll in another episode, to kind of analyze how it fits into different kinds of games that you have in game theory. But I think it's pretty clear that they were following a kind of a game theory interaction there. So I think you're dead right, and I think it's really interesting as well.
Yeah, and what's nice about this one is, a lot of times when you have game theory, you have multiple players, maybe not all knowing they're even playing, like you do in the Janeway version, the B plot. You have multiple players where one person is going after an outcome, but with the doctor, you're really seeing a one-on-one. There are a couple of ancillary players, but it's really a one-on-one. And in game theory, there's more than one outcome, or there's more than one type of game that can be played. It can be where two are facing each other, battling head-to-head like a football game, right? Or you have where the two are trying to get to the same outcome but have to play by the rules. And then there's other ones where you don't necessarily know what the outcome is supposed to be, or there's another version where both players have to make moves simultaneously. So they have to make a move without knowing what the other one's doing. This is as clear-cut a head-to-head game as there can be. The doctor wants medicine for red. The other guy says it won't happen. And now they're going to figure out who's going to win. And in the end, the doctor wins. He does it by pretty drastic means, but he does it.
And another interesting thing is raised with this interaction, which is he's doing it because of a larger moral issue that he wants to solve. He wants this guy to change his own rules so that red sector can all get medicine, right? And he has to do that in order to save himself because he's now considered red sector. So that's why the doctor wins. But in a sense, he put this guy into a very, he did violence upon this guy. He put his life at risk. He put him in an uncomfortable situation in more ways than one. And essentially, this means he did some level of violence to this guy in order to achieve this outcome. And so when he goes back to Voyager, he's talking to Seven of Nine, and he says, he wants to find out if he had been compromised, if he had lost his morality subroutines, and Seven gives him a clean bill of health, and he's concerned, and she says, why are you concerned? And he explains what happened, and Seven says, something to the effect of that he sacrificed, or he hurt this guy, but for a greater good, for the, a greater population that the Doctor cared about. And the Doctor says, I don't aspire to Borg ideals. Meaning he doesn't believe that it's okay to sacrifice an individual for the collective, which is, as we've talked about up till now, that is something that Marxists and socialists and collectives like the Borg can believe in. This kind of the good of the many outweighs the good of the few, I suppose, but in a more extreme form where an individual may be sacrificed for a greater number, for a collective. We'll talk about that, as I say, in the future when we talk about the Borg and individualism versus collectivism. But in any case, the Doctor taps into this and he says, I don't aspire to Borg ideals. He doesn't want to do this. And bringing us back to the issue of the allocator as a market system versus a planned system, this is an interesting remark because he's saying he believes in individualism. He's saying he doesn't believe in violence. He believes in the non-aggression principle, maybe. He doesn't want to do violence. He doesn't believe that it's okay to hurt this guy in order to help the greater good. But in a sense, if you're thinking of this allocator system as a market system of healthcare, you can say, but the overall system was so bad and hurt the poor so much, killed the poor so much, that in fact, maybe you do need to sprinkle a little collectivism in. Maybe you do need a little bit of public health care, of the collective having a bit of power. And even if that means that an individual who's better off suffers a bit, gives up some of their medicine, or like this guy has to have a disease for a moment in order to figure out that these people with this disease deserve the medicine, maybe that's okay to achieve this greater outcome. But that's kind of a means versus ends issue again, and you don't want to use violence to achieve your ends. So what do you think?
Well, I think I agree with the Doctor 100%. In fact, I also think that the non-aggression, it doesn't matter because you can justify that they are in fact the aggressors in the first place. So you're just defending the people who are having violence done upon them. I also I never liked that line that he doesn't support a Borg collectivism, because he wasn't sacrificing one of his own to make things better. He was attacking an enemy. In his mind at the time, the head of that hospital was an enemy. So Borg, when they talk about collectivism, they're not worried about killing me. They're talking about their own. Other Borgs they're willing to sacrifice other Borgs for the good of the group. He wasn't willing to sacrifice the Doctor on the red level. So I never really liked the line in general. I do like the fact that he was worried about the ethics of the whole thing. And I do like the fact that they didn't find anything wrong. I would have been very upset if the writers had written it that, yeah, there's degradation in one of your ethics matrix, let me fix it. Because it would have been a cheap way out of answering the question, was it good or was it not good for him to attack that man in order to save the quote-unquote lower end of society overall. And we're led to believe that they put in a new system, and in that new system, the people on red they'll still not get medicine on red, interestingly enough, but they will be moved to blue to get the medicine.
Right. No, yeah, you do make a good point. I mean, it's not an innocent who is being sacrificed. It's the guy who was part of the system and putting it into place. But he wasn't the creator of the system. He wasn't, he was a pawn in the system in a way as well. So can you can see, and certainly the doctor is he doesn't believe in violence of any sort. Even when someone was going off to be executed, he wants to save their life first and make sure they don't get hurt in his sick bay. And he saves everyone, bad guys, good guys, whatever. So from him, it makes sense that he would equate it with Borg ideals or something. But you're right. It's not just it's not sacrificing one of the red level people or anything. It is different. But to the doctor, it makes sense.
Right.
All right. Well, we've been talking for about an hour about critical care and markets versus collective allocation systems. And do you have any final thoughts to help us wrap this up now?
Well, I just hope, again, and I'm going to say this at the end of a lot of episodes, I hope this makes people think in a different way about the episodes than when they initially saw it. I hope that they see the different ways the economy is actually playing a role in many of the commentaries that Star Trek is trying to make to us, and to see maybe different sides of the story than they did the first time, maybe see it a little more in depth. But I really enjoyed this episode. I really like what it had to say. I really like that, as I said before, that the Doctor didn't have something wrong with his ethics matrix, that none of his subroutines for extra ethics were actually damaged, because it would have taken a lot away from the episode if he had done that, and then you find out later, well, he wasn't really thinking clearly. I also like the way that he was so dead set on saving people that he was willing to go after an enemy to the point where he would sacrifice that enemy's life. And at the time, he saw that man as an enemy. He did not see him as a contemporary. He didn't see him as a colleague. He was an absolute enemy. And he did what he had to do. He convinced the people around him what they should be doing. He taught another doctor that saving people was the ultimate goal. It wasn't about saving a society, because if you save the people, eventually you'll save the society. And moving on from there, he ended up taking a course of action that could have killed somebody, but he did it for altruistic reasons. He wasn't staying there long enough to worry about it. He wasn't going to have to deal with that system for very long. He knew that. And he still did it because it's the right thing to do. So what are your final thoughts on this episode?
Yeah, I think you make some really interesting points there. My final thoughts are that I do think this is an amazing episode for looking at allocation in healthcare, which is something that's difficult to do. It can be quite a complex problem. And a lot of people don't fully think through the whole way that it works in a market system and what they're actually agreeing to if they agree for it to be allocated that way. I think it's a really interesting episode, a really interesting light upon which to look at that question. And I'm glad we had a chance to look really closely at it. I think that the Doctor being willing to sacrifice someone does raise certain issues in terms of collectivism and individualism, which we'll get into in future episodes. But it also kind of helps shed light. I think all of these different aspects, the game theory aspect that you mentioned, all of these things kind of feed in to give this kind of rich tapestry that allows you to look at this issue of healthcare allocation in totally a new way. And I hope that we brought some of that to the people listening to this, because it is, a fascinating subject and probably one that we can talk even more about in the future. All right. So it's been fun talking about critical care and healthcare allocation in markets and socialism. But that's not the only thing that we've been talking about on Trek FM. So here's a quick look at some of the other things that you may have missed elsewhere on Trek FM.
Previously on Trek.fm. To the journey!
And then, they're all up on the bridge and everyone's like, oh, what's B'Elanna doing with her day off? And Tom's like, oh, she's binge watching Bill Nye. She's been there, in her PJs since 8 o'clock this morning.
I can picture she's been watching Bill Nye all day. Tom comes home and she says to Tom, Tom, have you ever thought about wearing a bow tie? You might look good.
But if he's on the bridge and says all that, would Captain Janeway know who Bill Nye the Science Guy is?
Yeah. It's Janeway.
The 602 Club.
So I graduated from high school in 1984. So this film came out in my, sophomore year in high school? So that was like prime formative years for me. This is, this and Mad Max were the R-rated movies that me and all of my friends wanted to go see.
Earl Grey.
Now, Aquiel is a Geordie episode, and I say that and I laugh because poor Geordie, he just does not know how to find women. And
that's putting it lightly, but yeah.
Guy.
Meta Treks.
Yeah, but what fun would that be? Then we wouldn't have red shirts. What fun is that? Zachary, what fun is that?
Councilman Troy, that is a smashing looking 70 nanometer wavelength dress.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link. We'd also love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place to join the larger conversation is the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use our form on the website at trek.fm/contact, choose message to a Trek FM show, and select the Briar Patch. That will come right to us. And you can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. Well, Patrick, so when you're not discussing crazy medical ethic issues and allocation of healthcare with me, where can listeners find you on the interweb and around the Trek FM network?
They can always find me hanging out in the Babel Conference. I always read all the topics. I tend to answer more now than I used to, but I'm always there. You can also find me on Twitter at MagicDrop5. It's one word. The 5 is a number, not the word. And I'm also the associate producer of Metatreks and can be found sometimes guest appearing on other shows such as Earl Grey and Warp 5. And Guinevere, when you're not allocating out diseases to corrupt businessmen who run hospitals, where can people find you?
Yeah. Well, I'm quite often on Facebook. I do post a lot and answer people's questions and queries. So you can find me on the Babel Conference there, or you can put my name into the search field. My name is spelled Guinevere. That's Guinevere, Nell, Nell. And you can also even email me if you want at guinevere.nell@gmail.com, or look out for the occasional tweet. And you can find that with Guinevere42, I believe is my Twitter thing. So if you'd like to help keep our shows coming to you each week here at Trek FM, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. So visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get the details. Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, all available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, so we appreciate any support you can give us and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM. And we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the rest of the Briar Patch team from the network, specifically C. Brian Jones, founder and publisher of Trek FM, executive producers Matthew Rushing and Ken Tripp, art director Aaron Harvey, production manager Richard Marquez, and Patreon manager Brandon Shea Mutala. Finally, don't forget to check out Enterprise in Space, a project of the nonprofit National Space Society. Visit enterpriseinspace.org to find out more and get your seat on the mission. And check out audible.com, which offers more than 180,000 titles for your desktop or mobile device. To get a free audiobook of your choice, visit audibletrial.com/TrekFM. Well, we must be heading back into the Briar Patch now, so we will see you next time. This is Guinevere and Patrick signing out.